Hey, it's Anne.
And Melody.
So this week marks 1 year since we launched the Culture Study podcast, and it has been just so amazing, just truly amazing. And it's only been possible because every week more and more of you have pitched in to fund it.
And you've probably noticed that we say something like, we have enough money to pay Melody through next month or whatever. And over the summer, one of our paid subscribers, Mary, asked this question in the comments. I love the pod, and I'm just curious if we're getting close to a point where we have enough subscribers that Melody's firing isn't perpetually 6 weeks away. I get so stressed for her, and I'm already a paying subscriber. This is my favorite comment of all time. So I thought I would use Mary's prompt to explain to the listeners why we phrase it that way and just generally how our money works. So we get to keep roughly 80% of all of your subscription dollars after fees and all of that. And then we split that pot 50-50. Anne sends me my half every Monday, best part of my Monday. I put it into a spreadsheet. I keep a running total of what is in that imaginary bank. And then every time an episode comes out, I subtract my rate from that pot of money. So then when we look at that pot of money, we divide it by my rate, and that's about how many episodes worth of money we have left. So for about the past year, the buffer has been about 4 to 6 episodes ahead at any given time. So building out that buffer would help us be able to plan further. We're also coming up on some of the annual renewals for things like our theme music and our recording platform. And I personally am trying to figure out how much work to take on next year. And if I'm not stretched as thin with other projects, we can do a lot more to make culture study even more fun and engaging.
And to be clear, I will take less money in order to keep paying Melody. We're not going to let this go away anytime soon,
Right.
But in order to make it worth both of our time,
Right.
and also worth your time. One of the things we talk about all the time in culture study is not doing labor for free, right? And paying people what they're worth, and also figuring out how to balance our time in ways that allow us to make space for the things that really matter. And that's what we're going for.
Yeah.
And I think to get to that point, we just, we need some annual subscriptions and just a little bit more of a buffer.
Yeah.
So if your renewal for an annual subscription is coming up, we would be so appreciative if you could keep it going. If you've been paying month to month, you could consider going annual as a vote of confidence in another year of the Culture Study Pod. And if you haven't yet become a paid subscriber, we would really appreciate any support you can offer. Maybe you don't want a paid sub for yourself, but you could give one to someone that you know who would love the show. And if it's just not in the budget right now, there are actually a lot of ways that you can help. You can share it on social media. You can tell everyone that you know about an episode that you listened to and loved. There are just a ton of ways that you can support the show.
And finally, we are making today's full episode free for everybody. So hopefully it keeps you company on your drive over the hills and through the woods to grandmother's house for Thanksgiving. So this episode is an example of what you'd get every week as a paid subscriber. There are no ads. There are no preambles like this one. And you'll always get the bonus Ask Anne Anything part of the show and access to the discussion thread, which almost always makes me laugh. So if that sounds good, head to culturestudypod.substack.com and join us.
Okay, on with the show. This is the Culture Study Podcast, and I'm Anne Helen Peterson.
And I'm Hannah McGregor, co-host of the podcast Material Girls and author of the book Clever Girl Jurassic Park.
I am so excited to talk today. I love talking about blockbusters in particular, but also just the movie industry broadly, and also 90s blockbusters especially. So I want to ask about your first or most vivid memory of a blockbuster experience.
It was definitely Jurassic Park. That's the first movie that I remember seeing in theaters and recognizing as having a kind of eventness to it. I had definitely seen movies in theaters prior to that. One of my early core memories is being taken to see Ghostbusters 2 a little too young. And I got too scared. And my mom had to take me out. My brother and father stayed and watched it, and my mom and I walked around the mall.
Did you hate, was it like the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man in Ghostbusters 2?
No, it was the guy with the face in the wall.
Oh, yeah. So when were you born? What year?
1984.
Okay, you're my brother's age. So I'm 1981. I was born in 1981.
Mm-hmm.
And also I grew up in a place that was like pretty rural, but like the only movie theater for like probably 100 miles in any direction. Or like major movie theater, like Cineplex. And by Cineplex, I mean 3 screens. And that Cineplex also had a drive-in. And that's where I saw Ghostbusters 2. Indelible experience. But I think I would also agree that my most vivid young blockbuster experience was seeing Jurassic Park. And I saw that so we had this Cineplex that was like in the more like strip mall-y area of town, but we had a picture palace downtown, like most towns over the size of 15, 20,000 did. And by picture palace, I mean like in a place like Seattle, it's a massive picture palace that can seat 1,000 that are all now like concert venues.
Never heard this phrase before. What's a picture palace?
So picture palace is how they referred to these like giant theaters that were built mostly in the 1920s, but into the 1930s and even 40s. They often had, they were atmospheric. And by that, I mean, they had a theme, right? So like the Egyptian in Seattle, and all of these themes are very problematic in various ways.
Of course.
The Egyptian is Egyptian themed. There were a lot of like the Orientalist, or also in Seattle, there's the Neptune. And so that had like a marine theme. And the biggest ones in places like New York and Chicago and San Francisco, they would have ushers with very specific outfits. They'd have daycare places. Like you couldn't drop your kid, but you could go with like a noisy kid to go and still be able to hear the movie and that sort of thing. Like they were very, very fancy. And a lot of these places either were chopped up in the 1960s, so post, which we'll get to this later about like all of the forces that led to like the decline in movie viewership in the 1950s. But some of them were chopped up into like multiplexes and oftentimes like very clumsily. Some of them, especially the ones that were downtown during urban flight, became porn theaters.
Yep.
And then some have been rescued and rejuvenated and are now musical venues.
Interesting.
So if you see like like someone on the level of like, I don't know, the National, like they will often play in a theater that used to be a picture palace. And we had like a mini version of that, like a lot of small towns did. It was called the Liberty, and it had a balcony.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And that is where I was sitting when I saw Jurassic Park, and when the scariest moment in the entire movie happens, when they're in the kitchen, there's 2 for me, and we can talk more about this: the kitchen, or when Newman from Seinfeld get like the really scary dinosaur comes
gets
out.
Inked.
I like had my feet up on the balcony and was like terrified and had my feet like slammed down. But
the most vivid memory I have of the first time seeing this movie, and it wouldn't have been in any venue as exciting as that, because Ottawa, Ontario in the 90s did not have cool theaters.
I bet you there was a theater downtown that
there was
like
absolutely. There was the one in my neighborhood was called the Mayfair, and it was an old like theater that had been converted into a movie theater, and it was a sort of arts, like single screen arts theater, where you could also see like, it's the kind of place that you went to see The Princess Bride in theaters, like classics.
Like they were like re-showing it,
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. But this was definitely like a suburban strip mall viewing, for sure. What I remember is the way the whole theater seemed to shake when those T-Rex footsteps started.
Totally.
And that sort of visceral experience of shared sensory input with a room full of strangers. It's the earliest memory I have of like that particular thing. Like we are all in a room in the dark and something is happening that's happening to the people on the screen and it's happening to us as well. And it is something that is spectacle, like fundamentally spectacular.
Yeah. And so much of it depends on being in the theater with those other people, right?
Yeah.
I got a VHS of Jurassic Park when it came out because I think that, like many other VHSs, it was sold in a partnership through McDonald's, where like if you got like a supersized McDonald's, you could get the VHS for like $6 or something like that.
Yeah. That's how we had all of our family VHSs. We're all like, if you get a 4-person family meal at Burger King, you can also get a copy of Wayne's World on VHS.
And at the time, it was an incredible deal because VHS were very expensive because they actually were expensive to make, but they essentially used these cheap VHSs as loss leaders. All right, so we should go into the questions.
And deeply, we go now into the history of the distribution of the VHS.
Listen,
and never talk about any of the questions.
Media studies PhD, I could go down any wormhole. Any and all. You recently published this darling little book. I'm using darling specifically because the book is in part about the monstrous feminine. It's a book about Jurassic Park, and it's called Clever Girl. How did it come to be?
Oh, it emerged, as so many things do, out of a set of material constraints, which is that I was making a podcast called Secret Feminist Agenda, and every second week I did a little like monologue episode to save myself from having to book guests every single week for interviews.
Yeah.
Because I decided to solo make and fully produce and edit myself a weekly podcast.
Oh,
what
that's
a bad idea.
Only an academic would do to themselves.
Yeah, we are perverts. So every second week I was like, oh, gotta come up with a topic. And, one such week arose and I had just made a friend watch Jurassic Park because it is one of those movies that I often show people because if they haven't seen it, I'm like, oh, this is a vital... Some people haven't seen it. It's wild. I know.
Is it that they're younger and that they didn't experience the wave of everyone has seen Jurassic? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Often friends who are a little bit younger or friends who weren't born in North America and so have a different set of early cultural touch points. So I'm often showing it to people. And when I show it to them, I am like, so the important thing for you to understand is that all of the dinosaurs have been engineered to be female so that they can't reproduce, which makes this a fundamentally feminist film, which is a thing that I have always said, with a little bit of, winky glibness. But I ended up making a podcast, a 15-minute podcast episode that was like, let me articulate for you my argument that Jurassic Park is a feminist film. And people really responded to it. And I think a big part of it is the way that people enjoy having an actually shared zeitgeisty piece of popular culture turned at a different angle in a way that reveals something new. And so often to do that, we've got to go back to historical objects of study because, the whole thing where we have almost no monoculture anymore makes it really difficult to do that with contemporary stuff.
Totally. I also think it's particularly resonant because the new versions of Jurassic Park, I don't even know their names. They're all Jurassic Universe.
Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom, Jurassic World Dominion.
Are not particularly feminist or have complicated negotiations of feminism going on. Yeah. And this is it's a pretty 90s understanding, but in a glorious way, I think. I also love this is something I've seen a lot in academic presses recently is doing what is more of a extended essay. The book itself is, I think it's 114 pages, right? Something close to that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's not
it's 20,000 words. It's, 2 articles.
Yeah.
In academic speak.
It's not, here's my article, and then here's 6 chapters that no one is going to be able to get through with different case studies. It's instead here is an argument, and here's a little bit more space for me to do a little bit more with it, and also to write, I think, a little bit more beautifully than is often expected in academic writing.
Well, the fun thing about this book is that it's actually not a scholarly press. ECW is an independent trade press in Canada, and this is the 14th book in their pop classics series, which are all of these little books about a particular, pop culture object. So I had, Jen Suk-Fong Lee, just this absolutely incredible culture writer in her own right, was my editor. And the experience of having a very smart editor who is not an academic, that experience was so fun, because trying to figure out how to make use of the set of critical tools that I have as an academic in a way that is like actually accessible and interesting for readers who don't, have a casual PhD in media studies.
Just casual PhD.
Just a casual PhD.
Both of you and I with our casual PhDs.
Just a little background PhD. Don't even worry about it. Don't even worry about it. Don't even think about it.
It doesn't even need to be on the resume. That's my new. That's how I have to do it. Sorry. Total diversion.
No,
I love that, and I think this book would also be like, I'm only saying this because we have a lot of academics in the audience. It would be an incredible book to teach.
Yeah, agreed.
Sign this to your class.
Teach this book. It's short.
But also a text that, like, if you do a screening of Jurassic Park and then you were able to talk about this, like, I think it would be an incredible way to generate conversation.
Thanks.
And the idea for today's episode is related to Jurassic Park, but then allows us to go kind of broader. So it's about, like, the state of the Blockbuster. And I know what, like, my definition of the Blockbuster is, like, how, like, in a media text did we define it. But I wonder if, like, for our audience, we can talk a little bit about, like, vibe.
Ooh, yeah. The Blockbuster vibe.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. So I think there's all kinds of ways that people define the Blockbuster. Like, I think sometimes it's a matter of, like, ratio of production budget to ultimate earnings.
Yep.
But I think in general, it's a big budget, star-led movie that is being positioned as available to the widest possible sector of audiences, right?
Yeah.
So, like, generally they're going to be somewhere in the PG-13 world, right? That they're not kids movies, but they want as much as possible for families to be able to go to them.
Yeah.
They're going to be sort of treading lightly around violence and sexual content. And they're going to be leaning really hard into some kind of spectacular element, like literally being a spectacle, so that they can sort of attach an eventness to the idea of going to the movie.
Yeah. And even the term blockbuster comes from, like, the line for the movie goes around the block. Like, that's how, like,
Does it?
Weird.
I thought it was named after a bomb, but what do I know?
No, I mean, that's how I was always told it by my professors, but maybe that's also, like, apocryphal lore.
To like the OED we go.
We will put this in the show notes, how we decide. But the one thing, like, there's been some interesting scholarship on, like, how the spectacle functions. And one of the things I remember is, like, they call whatever spectacle is, like, it could be a sex scene, it could be something blowing up, it could be a car chase, but you could group those under a categorization called a whammy. And then they think when you're creating a blockbuster, you want so many whammies per minute, not minute, but, like, every 12 minutes you need a new whammy, essentially. And so it, like, you keep the flow very like, keep people engaged through those whammies over and over again. Yeah. I think another thing is that, like, they employ a very classic 3-act structure that, like, most classic Hollywood cinema does.
Yeah. Very simple narratives for the most part, right?
Melodrama.
Like, melodrama for sure.
And, like, even I think sometimes people think melodrama is always, like, drama, but melodrama, like, a Top Gun is a melodrama, right? Like Jurassic Park is a melodrama in many ways.
Definitely.
Like,
and like a morality play.
yes. Trying to make the world morally legible in some way, which there's an interesting commentary about genetics and ethics and all that sort of thing going on as well.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that I think about is that the contemporary, like the very contemporary blockbuster, the IP has become the star more than the star.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So the idea of movies being star-led has sort of, there's conversations about whether or not we actually have movie stars big enough to sell movies themselves anymore, or if it's studio and IP now that sells movies and stars are in service to that. And I think we can certainly see the sort of industry logic of that playing out in the way that, stars are back to signing these like multi-film studio deals to play a particular Marvel character forever until Disney decides that they're done with them, which kind of harkens back to like, the studio
system.
Yeah, exactly. It feels like we're returning to that from this
Slightly
sort
more
of
money.
with a lot more money, which is why the sort of few stars out there who seem still able to sell a movie are such interesting case studies.
Totally.
Like sort of Tom Cruise seems to still be a movie star, but I would say Chris Pratt is not. Chris Pratt is just a useful thing to plug into IP.
Totally. Just like a white guy. And the other thing that's interesting is like the movie industry has always been global, but originally pre-talkies, the content itself was much more global in terms of like you had productions coming out of Sweden, you had productions coming out of Japan that would be global hits. Hollywood then like essentially like becomes this hegemonic force, and so much of the popular productions that are coming out, there are obviously huge exceptions with like Bollywood and that sort of thing, but most of the like huge blockbusters that are circulating globally are still very white, very straight. And I think what we've seen, especially with the development of the Chinese market over the last like 20 years, are these gestures that are like, the leads are still white, but look at this. Here's a Chinese star.
This like increasing reliance that the blockbuster movie has on a global audience, right? On sort of domestic is not actually going to, there's like just not enough people seeing movies in the US to actually fund these. So they're depending on like a certain performance in China, for example. And so increasingly we're seeing studios cast like celebrity Chinese actors in big blockbuster movies to get that pull. I mean, this is part of why the Fast and the Furious franchise has been so successful, because there's they do such a good job of bringing in a cast that has, legitimate global appeal.
Yeah. Okay. I can hear Melody whispering, not whispering, but she's just like, I can. Okay, so
for once, I'm just really enjoying the ride.
For once.
No, that's not what I mean. Normally I am harassing Anne to like get a move on,
like,
but I'm just like really enjoying this.
She's like, stop talking about the picture palaces. So I think everyone knows, and the statistics back this up. Fewer people are going to the movies. There are fewer movie tickets sold, and we will put all of our statistic back up in the show notes. Then, I think the number sold is half of what it was in 2004, which is wild.
Yeah.
And there's some obvious reasons and some not so obvious reasons. What do you think? Like, what's your overarching theory here?
Should we start with the obvious reasons?
Yeah. Let's start with
like,
the obvious reasons.
It's the advance of home viewing technology, alongside the rise of other forms of immersive media that just sector off this potential audience, right? Like video games and prestige TV, and right? So there's like lots of other stuff competing for our attention. But if we look back at, for example, the dawn of the VHS,
Yep.
we see a similar moment where when new technologies emerge that allow people to watch things at home, to have more control over, everything about their viewing experience for a period of time, in the case of VHS, viewership dropped off. And it picked back up, right? We can talk about the relationship between the VHS and the sort of contemporary Blockbuster as a way to try to get people back in theaters.
Yep.
And I think one of the biggest things that's happening right now is that there is so much incredibly sophisticated technology that people can use to watch things at home that like even the people who are interested in the eventness of movie viewing can reproduce that eventness in their own homes quite easily. And a lot of the time, the companies that are producing the movies are the same companies that are making the technology that you use to watch the movies at home. So they're telling you, like, please go see movies, but then they're also at the same time being like, psst, you don't have to have the world's biggest TV.
Yeah. Yes. And I also think, like, obviously COVID discouraged people from group activities in any sort of capacity. And then I think people are also unaccustomed to one screen viewing, or increasingly, this is not true for everyone, but I think a lot of people have become very accustomed to watching something on the big screen and then also playing around with their phone or being on their computer, right? And what I love about the movies is that you cannot do that.
Yeah.
But it's difficult to encourage people to, if you're not used to that, or if you have become unaccustomed or unpracticed at that, to do that. It's also expensive. Like we can talk about like how inflation and what a ticket would have been in 1950, but to take your family to the movies
is really expensive.
Is very expensive now.
Yeah. Certainly it's become something that like a lower middle class family like my own growing up, it was already a treat and it would be pretty much a prohibitive family activity, for the equivalent family to us in 2024.
Yeah. I go to the movies very seldom now, even though it is my favorite thing to do. And I love going to the movies by myself. And so much of it has to do with the fact that I live on an island. It just makes it much more difficult. If there was a movie theater on my island, we don't have a gas station, but it'd be cool if we had a movie theater.
If I had a independent movie theater in my neighborhood, I would go to it all the time. Every time I've lived somewhere where I'm like walking distance from a one screen movie theater, I am there constantly.
Yep.
There isn't one close enough to me now. And so that's certainly part of it, right? And we can talk about the way that like people are being driven out of urban centers, the idea that like you're not close to kind of anything.
Yep.
And I think the culture of multitasking has become so pervasive that not only do we sometimes struggle to like sit and pay attention to a thing, but it also feels really indulgent to be like, I'm going to not check my work email for 2 hours.
Yeah.
Where do I get off?
Or like I went and saw Killers of the Flower Moon earlier this year, and like that's a 3.5 hour experience. Also felt very indulgent, exquisite, and absolutely the way that that movie should be seen, because I think there are so many ways that we can like give ourselves excuses to stop watching something, right? And what a movie theater does is like it forces you to hold your attention in that way.
Yeah.
And okay, the last thing I'll say is that the middle class of movie going has disappeared. So the things that I would have loved to have seen in a theater, like rom-coms that you'd go with a friend, right? Like Merchant Ivory prestige dramas, like those have all disappeared, and they show up in prestige television.
They've moved to streamers,
to streaming. So like that sweet middle is gone, and so now you have like micro budget horror films and $300 million blockbusters with existing IP. So there's not a ton of room for like, as people say, like the adult moviegoer.
Yeah. Yeah. And depending on what you have access to, I live in a major city. And so there's always something interesting and independent playing. But if we look at the actual sort of makeup of, what movies are being funded, what movies are being produced, what movies do most people have access to. The reality is that most people do not have access to anything outside of the horror to blockbuster spectrum. And the harder you make it for people to access a thing, this is I think maybe going to be a really mind-blowing revelation for your listeners. When you make it harder for people to do something, they do it less.
We come here for the big thoughts. Okay, let's get into our questions. This one is from a listener who is also named Hannah.
There's been a lot of talk about blockbusters being in decline, but what explains the occasional movie that does become a blockbuster? What do movies like Barbie, Top Gun Maverick, Twisters, etc. have in common that have allowed them to reach those blockbuster heights when so many other blockbuster beat movies failed to get there?
So the first thing I see in those movies that were named is it's all pre-existing IP.
Yep, for sure. And I think doing something simultaneously following the pattern of making use of pre-existing IP, but successfully recovering pre-existing IP that hasn't been wrung out for the past 20 years. Yeah. So like a lot of the IP that studios have, they have just like exhausted.
Yep.
And all three of these examples, Twisters and Top Gun Maverick are sequels. Is Twisters a sequel? It's not a remake.
It is not. It's I would say it is evocative. Like there is one moment where they use one of the pieces of equipment that they used in the original Twister. And that's it. And part of the, and then also the central premise, which is we are chasing twisters. Like we are after tornadoes. And tornadoes are dangerous.
The star that has returned is Tornado.
Yes.
That's who we're.
That is the returning, the consistency. The other thing that is common between at least two of these movies is Glenn Powell, who is a real movie star, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that that's something that's fascinating is like you need someone who has some of that wattage in order to turn something into a distinctive blockbuster that people are like, I really want to go see this. Not just like, I guess it's the next Marvel movie, right?
Yeah. And it's not, all it's asking from me is a kind of like passive presence in the movie theater. The Marvel movies at this point are like largely incomprehensible, I think. Mm-hmm. Like
I have no idea what's happening.
No, and most people don't. Like most people are just not following the lore this closely. But a movie like Twisters or Top Gun Maverick are offering you a narrative, offering you like an entry point into some sort of straightforward narrative arc, have that sort of comfortable cushion of the recognizable IP, but are also something that you can just, if you haven't seen Twister or Top Gun recently, you can still enter into these movies with ease. But it is that like, in part, I think it's a matter of like, if you throw enough paint at a dartboard, is this a good analogy? When you throw paint at dartboards, eventually you're going to hit a bullseye. A perfect analogy, I think, actually, we can all agree. Like, if you reboot everything, some of it's going to hit.
Yeah.
The whole sort of, the concept of the Black Swan event, right, which is like used often in publishing conversations to talk about books like Harry Potter, that just like nobody could have predicted the way that took off. And ultimately there ends up being a lot of sort of money and resources behind it, but like it getting picked up in the first place is kind of unpredictable and non-reproducible. And that's kind of one of the truths behind the blockbuster as well, is that a lot more movies are always trying to be blockbusters than successfully are, because there's always some unpredictability.
It's kind of like venture capital in that capacity, right? Like there you have to invest in a lot of things and just hope that one goes big. But I do think that like the studios are so risk adverse now that they only will invest in something that has that previous IP. And most of the time they are not willing to do something like what they did with Barbie, which is allow Greta Gerwig to be weird with it. Right? And I think that's what made it Barbie into the phenomenon that it was, is that it was reaching beyond the typical blockbuster audience to get people who maybe that was the only movie that they saw in theaters that year.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, what really struck me about Barbie is how successfully they managed to attach eventness to the experience of seeing it, right? The idea that like this is a movie that you're going to go see in a group and everybody in the group is going to dress in pink and you're going to take a group photo. A big part of it was like a really smart and successful marketing budget, certainly. But then it also was a legitimately interesting movie. And when I think about things like Top Gun Maverick and Barbie, I also think about audience saturation with the experience of watching CGI and the impact of like practical effects, stunts, real physical. Like people like seeing Tom Cruise movies because he famously does his own stunts, famously. You know, and a big part of the appeal of Barbie was that they made everything. And I don't want to make any sort of sweeping claims about like the experience of practical effects versus the experience of CG, because I think in the 90s, the presence of a computer generated effect was part of the novelty of the blockbuster. And now it's just become so widespread that what is novel and interesting, what feels like you're seeing something new, is seeing something that is a practical effect. And that like novelty is so key. The right balance of novelty and familiarity is so key to the blockbuster sweet spot.
Yeah, that's so true. That like it needs to have something that you're like, oh, and I know what the next beat is going to be, right?
Yep.
I feel like we're going to have this really interesting moment, and it's starting already, of looking back on some of the CGI of like the early 2000s and being like, wow, that looked like shit, right? Whereas a lot of the effects from the early 90s, or even like I think about Jaws, like it actually is very good, right? Or even like original Star Wars.
Yeah.
And it's because they had to be so incredibly mindful and couldn't just be like, oh, we're just going to let the computer just render this, right?
Yeah. They had to be very careful and cautious with the use of effects because they were very expensive.
Yeah.
And if you overused them, they were going to look really crummy, right? So like famously, we actually see very, very little of Jaws in Jaws. We see very, very few dinosaurs in Jurassic Park.
Yeah.
And that part of the sort of what makes it still feel special and exciting is that they are only appearing in sort of heightened. They can still be a whammy because they're not in every single scene, right? Like if something just saturates the entirety of a movie, it loses its effect really, really quickly. And that kind of that kind of tasteful restraint, I think, is a quality in filmmaking that is perhaps not valued much these days.
There are some directors who do not know how to use it. I'm so interested to see what the new Gladiator is going to do in terms of this too, because like that is a pre-sold idea that, and you have a big star or a big potential star in Paul Mescal, but also I don't trust like that you can make a sequel to Gladiator and make it not be like not that great.
You know, the other example that I find really interesting that could have been grouped in with the, you know, Top Gun Maverick and Barbie is Dune.
Oh, right.
And that is another like a pre-existing IP, some, you know, big budget movie stars, a successful an interesting enough director that they're doing something that feels exciting with it.
Yeah.
And also a little bit, and this is how I felt with Barbie as well, like a little bit of stunting by which I mean, Dune is a famously impossible story to adapt.
Yeah.
Many have tried, all have failed. Similarly, the idea of doing a good job of adapting Barbie into a movie, right? It feels a little bit like you want to turn out to see it because it's either going to be really cool or a colossal disaster.
Yeah.
And that feels interesting because even though both of those examples are, a pre-existing IP, there's something a little risky about them.
Yeah. I think that's part of how Barbie was successful vis-a-vis word of mouth, right? It's like, can you believe it? The Barbie movie is actually good.
Yeah. Can you guys, they pulled it off. Can you believe this?
Right. And then put this article in the show notes. There's a great New Yorker profile of like the access that Mattel gave Greta Gerwig and how like Mattel and other companies are trying to think about how can we make the game Life into a movie that isn't ridiculous, right? Like, how do you actually do that little twist that's a commentary on the IP itself? And that's part of what we're talking about, too, I think, is like even Top Gun Maverick is in some way, like the spectacle is in some ways Tom Cruise's face and his body. Like, what is happening to his aging body? And like, who is his heir? Like, is his heir Glenn Powell or is it Miles Teller? And personally, I think it's Glenn Powell. But next question has a theory for why blockbusters resonate in various seasons. So this comes from Alana.
I feel like part of the reason Barbie was so special was because it brought people together in a blockbuster way with fashion, the director, the cast, and the political moment. Is there a chance that election years of despair and disassociation between the brutality of the world and the movies that are actually interesting can help bring back the blockbuster for good?
I mean, if despair brings the blockbuster back, then we are in great shape vis-a-vis the future of the blockbuster.
I do think that there is an interesting argument to be made about the decline of monoculture and the rise of polarization, right? Like that's something that would need to be done very carefully and by someone who is has more time on their hands than I think either of us do. Since you're out here just producing podcasts by yourself.
Well, not anymore.
I know, but you got a team. But
I got tenure in Zoloft, so we're doing a little better. But yeah, like that, like an actual sort of deep study of what is going on politically at the moment of particular blockbusters. Frankly, I'm sure somebody's already engaged in it.
I do think that something like Barbie, like even pointing out that that Barbie brought people together, I think that it actually pissed off a lot of people. Yeah. One of the stars of Rush Talk, Kylan, who looks like a Barbie, she watched it and she was like, "This is dumb." And I think like it's particular version of like a kind of feminism light. Right? Yeah. Like in the famous America Ferrera speech, like those were always like the parts where I was like, okay, if we're going to write a lot more about this, like these are things that I would want to interrogate more. I do think that type of like almost girl powery feminism, like life is hard, but like, why don't we just like, life is hard for women. What if it wasn't so hard?
Wouldn't that be nicer?
What if we didn't have to wear heels? That was very palatable.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, one of the things that makes, I think, a movie like Barbie or Top Gun Maverick actually like go beyond sort of the opening weekend spectacle numbers and have people like returning to see it again and having conversations about it is that there is some kind of there. Yeah. At least enough to generate conversation. That there's readings available of it. Yes. It's very hard to say much of anything about the third Guardians of the Galaxy movie. But there's at least a conversation to be had around watching Tom Cruise age and star in a movie that is about aging, or watching Margot Robbie star in a movie that is about the objectification of women's bodies. Like,
Right.
there's a conversation to be had. I think Barbie is sort of aesthetically quite a successful film, because I think that sort of girl boss feminism 101 is a surface layer, and I think that there's something beyond that. I think you can keep going and get deeper into the movie than that, but that gives it a sort of a readily legible narrative that also makes it accessible for further conversation. And that, you know, is a huge part of how a blockbuster happens, is that, like, people watch it and then go talk to somebody else about it. They don't forget it 30 seconds after they walk out of the movie theater.
Yeah. That's such an important point. I think the other thing was, especially with something like Top Gun, is that it also reproduces discourses that we are very familiar with in terms of like American jingoism. Like it's so, like, there's something so ham-fisted in Top Gun Maverick about the fact that, like, because you can't be against the commies anymore, right? So instead it's like a country that's like clearly Iran, but they don't say that it's Iran. Like, it's clearly
it's just
Iran.
some bad guys. Don't worry about it.
It's just some bad guys that we need to bomb, which also, like, that gives, like, allows, or is actually very on point in terms of, like, how we think about drone warfare and, like, oh, it's just bad guys. Like, it's okay because it's bad guys.
Yeah.
Like, we don't even have to, like, name who they are or know anything else about them. As long as someone tells us that they're bad guys, then they should get bombed.
Yeah. Yeah. Which, again, like, melodrama. Like,
right.
and the appeal of the moral simplicity of melodrama in the midst of, say, the contemporary moment in which people are, like, you know, navigating on a regular basis the incredibly complex experience of, like, understanding what's happening in the Middle East.
Right.
And the impossibility, I mean, people desperately want to say, like, well, there's good guys and bad guys. And again, I'm full of hot takes now. Not a huge fan of what the state of Israel is doing right now. I think it's kind of monstrous. But it's not a melodrama. It's incredibly messy, gritty, difficult political experience, and the offering of a narrative that simplifies the world down to good guys and bad guys certainly has a particular appeal during a moment like this.
Well, and there's a reason why Oppenheimer, while successful, is not what I would call a blockbuster. Right? Like, there are aspects of melodrama in that movie, but it is offering a much more complex understanding of, like, even what creating and dropping the bomb did to all of us, right? And the wages of those decisions.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you know who's great still at blockbusters and keeps kind of nailing it every time is James Cameron. Like, that guy knows. One, I think he genuinely experiences the world as melodrama. This is my, like, fan theory about James Cameron.
I do too. I think this is real. Like, he's like,
I don't think he's simplifying the way that he sees the world for the purpose of filmmaking. I think
but, like,
he
even
actually sees the world like that.
The narrative of making Titanic, the narrative of making Avatar is like, good triumphed over evil. Like, no one wanted me to make these movies, but I did it.
But I did. And now the movie exists. And can you believe it? It's so much movie. And and he's so interested in a melodramatic narrative accompanied by a cool new thing to look at. That's all he wants. He wants to show you something cool you haven't seen before. And then he wants to layer that over a story, a very simple story about good and evil. And every time he does it, like, he does seem to knock it out of the park.
Yeah. No, but then I think about someone like, why am I blanking? Director of Oppenheimer.
Christopher Nolan.
Christopher Nolan. Like, I find Christopher Nolan really interesting because he is arguably the only director that can make a movie that is not with existing IP that people will go see as if it were. And for all of the like dude bro critiques of him, I do think none of his movies are offering a simple understanding of the world. And to me, it's proof that like there is an appetite for a melodrama that twists and that asks you to think more about like, is this the good guy? Is this the bad guy? Like those sorts of questions. And I think that we actually crave more of those type of films. But when you are working with existing IP, it is difficult to create narratives and that also need to be globally legible.
Yep. So you have to work with existing IP. You need to create narratives that are globally legible. You have to somehow get anything interesting that you're doing through a committee of probably hundreds of terrible, boring white men. And so you know, in most cases, the only people who can do it are people who already come in with a certain amount of power. Yeah. Right. So Christopher Nolan enters into these arrangements with a pre-existing power of his own to drive forward an unusual film. And so, you know, certainly we need to have, as part of this larger conversation, like, we got to think about, well, who can even enter the conversation with that kind of power in the first place?
Absolutely.
It's very, very few people. And it's not a coincidence that it's like a white guy who makes movies that are particularly appealing to other white guys.
Right. Do you know the maxim that like there's 4 quadrants of moviegoers, very broadly understood? So there's adult women, adult men, teen women, teen men.
Yeah.
And women will go see anything that a man will see, but men will not go see anything that a woman will see. And adults will go see anything that a teen will see, but teens won't go see anything that an adult will see.
And so if you're making a movie for everybody, it's got to be for teenage boys.
Yep.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah, and we sure do see an awful lot of that. I mean, again, part of why Barbie sort of shocked people is they were like, a movie with a budget for women? Can it be done?
Can men also go see this movie? Wow, interesting.
Incredible. They're very confused by it, but Ryan Gosling's there, and that makes them feel safe.
Also, it's funny and good.
Yeah,
okay, last question. This will be our Ask It Anything question for this episode, and this comes from Spencer.
I love going to the movies alone, but when my friends say they really want to see a big new movie that's playing, I'll ask if they want to come see it with me. They usually seem completely bemused by this offer, almost as if they forgot seeing a movie in theaters was even an option these days. They politely decline and say they'll just catch it on streaming. Months later, they'll stream it at home while scrolling their phone, not really paying attention to it, and then say, "It was mediocre, I'm glad I didn't waste money on it in theaters." Is there any way to convince people that they will genuinely enjoy a movie more if they see it in theaters instead of passively watching it at home? Or has the convenience of the streaming era permanently eliminated theater going for most people?
Oh. I feel you, Spencer. It's like, it's just so much better to go see a movie in the theaters. It just is. We all know it. This is one of the things that we're like, I hate looking at my phone all the time, and yet I look at my phone all the time. Like, we understand that there is an alternative, but it's very difficult, as you said earlier, when it has become harder and harder to see movies for financial and time reasons and babysitting options and like all that stuff, right?
Yeah.
To make it happen. And also, I think, as you said, people think that it's wasteful to go see a movie.
Yeah.
Like that you somehow, like, it's indulgent.
Yeah, I really think that's true. I really think that it feels, particularly if you have a big TV at home that you spend a bunch of money on. Yeah. Right? It's like, oh, well, I should watch it on this thing that I have. Or I'll, I want to be able to watch it in little bits. Right? Because I can't, it feels impossible to set aside 3 hours to do one activity. Feels impossible, or maybe for some people, simply is impossible. And Spencer, part of what you might be experiencing is your friend group aging. because that is certainly a thing. That, like, when you're in your 20s, your friends have time. Like, my friends and I, you have very little money, but you've got time. My friends and I used to, we figured out which movie theaters had concessions before ticketing and which ones had concessions after ticketing. And if the ticketing all kind of happens like at the front of the theater and then concessions and screens are beyond, you can just buy one movie ticket and then spend all day in that movie theater.
Oh, yeah.
And we would absolutely, like, on a Saturday, just go see like 4 movies for the price of one. Like, it was, you know, a popular activity. And the idea of having a whole Saturday that I don't have anything else I need to do now is unheard of. And so, you know, part of it is just that shift in my own life and the kinds of, my friends have kids, we've got full-time jobs, you know, I want to be able to put on a movie and make dinner, or like put on a movie and like putter around and clean up, because if I go to a movie and come home 3 hours later, none of the household tasks that had to be done have been done. So you know, that's all part of it for me. And my response to, like, how do I get my friends to go to a movie is, this is going to blow your mind. Instead of trying to convince them that it's better for them, just say that it matters to you.
Yeah. Yeah. Just, like, make it into something that, like, hey, can we go to dinner before? Right?
Yeah.
Or, like, if you like going to see movies with people, I only like to go see movies with like 5 people, because I don't always appreciate the conversation afterwards. Like, sometimes I just want to hang out in my own head. My number one favorite thing is going to a movie by myself. When I was in grad school, I would go at least twice a week to the movies. Like, I didn't have any money, but what I did have, I spent on going to the movies.
I also love going to the movies by myself. I love your very subtle way of being like, I don't want to go to the movies with a dummy.
No, it's not.
Gonna say.
It's just like, no, but like.
But I agree. Like, I've got.
Especially if you're seeing something that's like kind of weird, or like asks you, like, wants to settle into your body a little bit, like, you can't talk about it right away.
Yeah.
Right. Or if you're just like weeping uncontrollably, which happens to me all the time in movies.
Yep.
Like, you just want to sit with those feelings. You want to feel your feelings. And if you have to perform a different sort of feeling for someone afterwards, I think sometimes that is not the experience that you're looking for.
One of my favorite sort of going to a movie by myself memories is going to see Arrival by myself, which is a perfect movie to see by yourself, so you can cry as much as you want.
Right? Because that movie is like tremendous. Like, it is.
Yeah. It's
visually
it's beautiful. It's visually beautiful. It's
the sound.
Immersive, slow, thoughtful, like a movie that really rewards attention. And it's much easier to pay attention when you are in a movie theater than when you are at home. So I went and saw it by myself, and I'm sitting there at the end, and, you know, it's got one of those crescendo endings where it's just like, oh my God. And I'm sitting there and I'm like feeling my feelings and processing this movie. And there's this older couple sitting right next to me. And the wife turns to the husband and goes, I don't get it.
This is why you don't go with other people to the movies.
It's like, all right.
The thing that convinced me to start going to the movies by myself when I was pretty young was going to see, like, if we wanted to get slightly more artsy, we had to drive half an hour to the nearby university town where they would have like slightly more artsy stuff. Like, we're talking like more like Miramax style. And so went to go see The Talented Mr. Ripley with like one of my high school friends. And we got done and I was like blown away by it. Like, in, you know, the ways that the 17-year-old would. And also that movie is really, really good. But my friend was like, that was weird. I was like, yeah, it was cool, right?
Isn't
like,
that exciting?
Yes. But that wasn't the conversation that we had. And managing someone else's feelings about something that you've just watched is sometimes something that you don't want to do. And I think that Spencer is kind of, the sadness that is coming to them is from managing their feelings when they have watched it in what in like a subpar way, right?
Yeah.
Like they don't want to have that discussion about Twisters when they watched it cut up into 4 pieces while also scrolling their phone.
Yeah. Yeah. Because you've had a fundamentally different experience.
Yes.
So trying to talk about a movie that you went and sat in a theater and immersively watched while doing nothing else, trying to talk to somebody who like half watched it while scrolling their phone is like, well, you actually didn't see the same movie.
Yeah.
You just didn't have the same experience. And so that the pleasure, and this is definitely a thing I've heard from a lot of like real film buff friends, is that like the pleasure of getting to talk to somebody about an interesting movie you've seen feels like it's harder and harder to access.
Yeah.
Because we aren't having those collective viewing experiences, and because the landscape of like meaningful film criticism online has like all other forms of criticism, like there aren't any real well-respected mainstream film critics. It's like you got to find the right Substack, and that is much harder to do than to just follow Roger Ebert. And so
I think that's why Letterboxd has become so popular, is because it has provided people a way to have those conversations. I find Letterboxd kind of mortifying because I think, like film conversations often can be, it's very performative when it's done for an audience, right?
Yeah.
But I understand why people like it. Yeah. And I think my advice to Spencer would be, you need to keep going to the movies because you love movies. And people like Spencer are what keeps the movie business alive. And I just wish the studios would maybe just do a little bit more to like make movies that I absolutely want to see in the theaters, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that
more...
seemed like indubitable. Like, I must see this in the theater. That's how I did feel that way about Twisters, and that's why I went and saw it in the theater.
Yeah. Yeah. I even have trouble hearing about movies these days, right?
Yeah.
Like, the landscape of information is so incredibly fragmented that sometimes there are major movies that I kind of don't even know.
Did you know there's a
happening.
new Mad Max and that it was really bad? I didn't.
I did. I definitely saw a trailer for it at another movie I was seeing with friends, and it came up, and I was like, no, never in 100 years. I love Mad Max Fury Road. I think it's a pretty much perfect movie.
I do too.
The last thing that I want is like a prequel about the trauma of the protagonist before the liberatory events of the film I've seen. I don't want to spend more time there. Whose idea was this? But if you aren't already seeing movies, then how do you find out about movies?
I know. I used to, when I lived in New York, I loved that I would see the actual paper ads, the billboards and the stuff that was in the subways for new television shows, for new movies. I felt much more grounded in the schedule of events. And I also, when there was something like Entertainment Weekly, right? It prepared me fall movie preview. Part of the way that I find out about movies now is the Big Picture podcast, which does a lot of different previews of stuff and talks in a way that I find very accessible about movies that are upcoming. Because sometimes you're like, I don't want to hear people talk about movies that I don't know about, right? But they, I think, do a very fantastic job.
Nice.
Melody wants me to ask you what would happen if movie theaters disappeared. And I almost didn't ask it because the idea makes me so sad that talking about it is it's like talking about the election. It just is really, really sad to me. But what do you think?
I can picture the current version of the Cineplex disappearing because it's such a specific business model, and we can see it as a business struggling right now, right? They're actively playing around with okay, how do we do this? In Canada, I don't know if this is the case outside of Canada, but they've just started charging an additional fee to book your seat online.
Yeah.
That they're just how do we get enough money to stay open? These monthly passes are becoming a thing, right? Get a membership and you can see as many movies as you want. They are scrambling. And I can see that 27 screen multiplex disappearing. I can't see movie theaters disappearing because there are too many examples of people spontaneously reproducing the effect of the movie theater via community screenings for me to believe that we would ever actually let that go.
Right.
Like, people are too into setting up a big screen in a park and gathering together to watch a movie. Like, we'll just find other ways to do it. And it might be fewer people do it, or it will take different shapes, but I just can't picture it going anywhere.
Yeah. Well, and also shout out to like small movie theaters, independently run movie theaters. Many of them are community supported and donation supported.
Yeah.
The Pickford Theater here in Bellingham is an example of that are doing incredible work to show all different types of cinema too.
Yeah.
Like, to not just show like whatever is going around. Like, there's always something that is a draw, like a movie that you have heard about, but also doing all sorts of like documentaries and local filmmakers and film festivals, and that's film culture to me. And I think that is still very much alive. And I don't think it's going anywhere either, but it makes me sad to think about. So go to the movies. Take this opportunity to like, and then we're also coming up on winter blockbuster season. So there's going to be stuff.
I, for one, will be seeing Wicked Part 1 as soon as humanly possible.
Melody in the background. Yes.
Yes.
When does it come out? Thanksgiving? Thanksgiving?
Yes.
You're gonna see Wicked, the first part of Wicked, and I'm gonna see Gladiator, and then we can talk about it after.
Yeah, we can exchange notes.
I'll be like, this is Paul Mescal right here.
Thank you. Is he a white boy?
He is. He was in Normal People.
I haven't seen it.
White boy with a mullet, specifically.
He does have a mullet.
Which Anne loves.
It's a hot mullet. Okay. All right. Hannah, where can people find you on the internet if they want to hear more from you?
You can find my website at hannahmcgregor.com. You can find all my podcasting work at awitchplease.ca. And if you want to follow me for fewer hot takes about media and more pictures of my outfits, I'm on Instagram at HKPMcGregor.
Strong recommend for following her. Thank you so much for coming on the show today. This has been a true pleasure.
Thanks for having me.
Melody, did we get everything?
I loved it.
Good.
I do. I'm going to keep rolling while I tell you that Hannah is correct and Blockbuster references a bomb. I looked it up.
That's so funny. I love that.
It was like the 1940s. Like, people were very familiar with this type of
It was like an atomic bomb, wasn't it? It was like a big bomb.
And so they're like, it's like a blockbuster because it's like the movie is going to have such an impact.
Well, now
this movie is
everyone can remember.
Blow you up.
But you can see how it's like, the line goes around the block.
Absolutely.
Who told me that? I'm gonna have to figure out the
find
professor
them.
who
Send
told
a
me
letter.
You find them. You track them down.
Me, I think I told students that too.
Oh,
this is how misinformation spreads, Anne.
Yep. Through the casual media studies PhD community. Thank you so much for listening to the Culture Study Podcast. Be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts because we have so many great episodes in the works, and I promise that you don't want to miss any of them. Some of the shows we're working on right now include The State of Thrifting, or Why Thrifting is So Sucky Right Now, What is Up with Kids' Toys, that's going to be an incredible and expansive conversation, and The Rise of Therapy Speak. If you want to submit questions for any of those episodes or for the Ask Anna Anything segment, we actually need some more of those. So especially if you want some advice from me, from Melody, you can actually specifically direct it to Melody. I'd appreciate that.
you could.
Go to our Google form at tinyurl.com/culturestudypod or check the show notes for a link. That's also where you can suggest topics for future shows. Today's episode is free for everyone, so if you like what you hear and you want to support the show, head to culturestudypod.substack.com. It's just $5 a month or $50 a year, and you'll get ad-free episodes, the Ask Anne Anything segment, weekly discussion threads for each episode, and a link to a special Google form so that your questions go to the front of the line. And if you're a paid subscriber, head over to the discussion thread and keep the conversation going. I'm especially interested in how we can frame this conversation about blockbusters on a week when we actually have two big blockbusters in the movie theaters. So if you've seen Wicked or Gladiators, is it Gladiators?
No, it's just Gladiator II.
Gladiator
It's not like
2.
Twisters.
If you've seen either of those and you want to talk about what makes them a blockbuster and whether they're good blockbusters, come and talk with us in the thread. The Culture Study Podcast is produced by me, Anne Helen Peterson, and Melody Rowell. Our music is by Poddington Bear. You can find me on Instagram at Anne Helen Peterson, Melody at Melodious47, and the show at Culture Study Pod.